Please feel free to add questions and comments to the chat, and we'll address them later on in the Q&A session after the presentation. So throughout our time together, we'll drop resources in the chat, and feel free to save those and take a look at them later. We also want to remind you that there's going to be a networking session immediately following the presentation. So we've received feedback from attendees of every past CANIE event indicating that you'd like the option to discuss the topics immediately after the sessions. And so during the networking session, Ine, Megan, and I are going to stick around, and we'll move between the rooms, and we'll be available to discuss these topics with you. So before we get started, we want to bring a welcome message to you from one of CANIE's co-founders, Pitulia Nicola.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us in the CANIE COP26 climate justice discussion. I'm Pitulia Nicola, and I'm one of the co-founders of CANIE. COP26 is a good moment to take stock and reflect on the past few years, as well as to consider how we can incentivize more ambitious action in the years to come. CANIE started in 2019 as a small group of people eager to push the climate discussion within the international education sector. At that point of time, the awareness of the issue was still at its infancy. And what progress have we seen in just a few years? Climate emergency and other sustainability issues are moving towards the very core of our sector. CANIE has played a role in the process by organizing a number of events, creating resources, and working with stakeholders across the globe. CANIE wants to see an international education sector which takes ownership of the climate crisis and catalyzes bold action to transform how we educate, collaborate, and advocate for the future generation of students. CANIE's role has been and is to empower, energize, and mobilize international education stakeholders to address the climate crisis with urgent and decisive action. We want international education stakeholders to take ambitious action to reduce their own carbon footprint, but also to use their influence within their own organizations and beyond to enhance the positive handprint of the sector. We want to see this to take place in collaboration with others and in a way that considers questions of intergenerational equity and wider questions of climate justice. Thank you for joining us today to discuss this topic, and we hope to see many of you join CANIE and help us in this important work.
So our mission for our time together today is to have you leave this session inspired to make social justice an integral component of your climate action work. As the field of international education transforms to reduce the harm that it currently causes to the planet, it's crucial that we understand the social impacts of the climate crisis and create restorative solutions. We envision a just transition and call on you to advocate within your spheres of influence, whether that's student recruitment, program administration, policy creation, or any other aspect of the field, to ensure social justice is front and center. So we plan to accomplish this by covering 3 areas. First, Ine will take you through the basic science of climate change and major sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Then we'll discuss how the climate crisis is connected to injustices and summarize some of the many impacts felt around the world. Then we'll take a look at climate justice through an international education lens. For this, we'll share, visualize, and describe what these intersections can mean for international education. And we'll look at some examples to help spark dialogue and action.
So we've all been hearing language such as we're in a code red for humanity and our house is on fire when talking about climate change. And language choices really can make a difference. Climate impacts are becoming increasingly more common and intense, and it's not enough to talk about only climate change when the impacts are slapping us right in the face. If any of us have managed to avoid feeling any of the climate impacts directly, I would say that the extent that which our families, our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues, our partners, humanity is being impacted, that's creating an echo of that slap that resonates across the globe and hits every single one of us. Jenny Lee is a professor at the University of Arizona, and she was a recent guest on one of our CANIE podcasts. She said in her discussion, you know, how much more urgent can urgent be? And how much more of an emergency can an emergency look like? We're getting to that point. And that's why you're going to hear us talk about shifting our language to emphasize what we're experiencing as a climate crisis. We're still going to describe global warming. We're still going to talk about climate change, but we're going to emphasize the reality of the situation that we're currently in together by using more accurate and current language. So to understand how we've reached this crisis point, let's start by just navigating some of the science basics. The greenhouse effect, it describes a process that the Earth has in place to regulate its temperature and how excess greenhouse gases are disrupting that balance process. So the sun is our primary energy source, and it's beaming down on us and creating this amount of solar energy coming into the Earth. Some of that energy is absorbed and it's re-radiated out as heat. So greenhouse gases are working to amplify the solar energy and retain the heat, which if it's under normal conditions, that's going to look like the Earth's temperature being at around 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit on average. But when we have this burning of excess fossil fuels, it creates extra layers of greenhouse gases, and that's blanketing and thickening the Earth's atmosphere. It's burdening the natural balance and the balance cycle of heat absorption. So too much heat's actually being retained, and that's what leads to global warming. And then over time, climate change, and now we're at a stage of climate crisis as the Earth's baseline temperature continues to elevate. A comprehensive summary of the science is outlined in the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we'll share a link to that in the chat. So where are all those excess greenhouse gases coming from? Well, in international education, we tend to talk a lot about transportation as our field's primary carbon emission source and negative contribution to the climate crisis. And that's for good reason. I mean, we do need to fly to places as part of our experiences a lot of times, but not always. But this image from the project drawdown, this is something they actually used the IPCC report information to create this image. This highlights other areas such as electricity, heat production, food, and agriculture and land use that account for larger proportions of greenhouse gas emissions than transportation does. About 60% of excess greenhouse gas emissions remain in the atmosphere, contributing to the warmth of the Earth, while current carbon sinks absorb some of the carbon emissions. So it's nice that we have some absorption going on. A carbon sink is anything that absorbs more carbon from the atmosphere than it releases. For example, plants or the ocean, soil. A carbon source is anything that releases more carbon into the atmosphere than it absorbs, like burning of fossil fuels or volcanic eruptions. But let's just be clear, carbon dioxide, carbon, isn't the only greenhouse gas emission, it's just one of the most abundant. But we are working to connect the dots now, the links of the climate crisis, racial and social injustice, and international education. And sometimes that really just starts by unpacking things, unpacking the science, as well as some of our everyday experiences and our educational knowledge. So let's continue to unpack some information to better understand the ties between the climate crisis and injustice. Well, okay, let me start out by just saying this. I am an American descendant of slaves. So that means that when the United States was trying to fight the colonialism of the UK, they were trying to get their freedom, my ancestors were not free. So when I think about colonization, well, I get upset. So let's talk a little bit about our global histories. It's full of colonization exploits and highlight patterns of economic pursuits tied to seeking and collecting resources such as land to build wealth and power, and often beginning with displacement and marginalization of indigenous communities and knowledge. The climate crisis is tied to our extraction and our use of these resources, while the direct consequences of the pursuit of resources are often absorbed by local communities, worse and worse. So ongoing levels of consumption and pollution, you know, the way that we're doing things can't be maintained as they exist now. Our population can no longer support behavior without thought for consequences to the Earth's and its inhabitants. So when I look at this quote, the exploitation of our planet's natural resources have always been tied to the exploitation of people of color. One of the things I think about is the prevalence of certain languages across the globe. Think about it. In your mind, think about which languages you hear the most and where they are. Spanish, French, English, Portuguese, just as an example. I would say Mandarin too, because so how are these languages mapping out our history of colonization and who was impacted? My first global experience was driving from Oakland, California to Jalisco, Mexico when I was 14 years old. And that was when I really started to understand something like the idea that the United States is not the only America. Spain was one of the primary colonizers of Latin America and had about a 100-year jump start on the colonial exploits of Great Britain. And colonization of the Americas by Spain and Portugal also impacted indigenous communities just across the Americas and influenced the direction of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery as well. So these deep, wide roots of history and colonization ideologies, these are really spread throughout our existing systems, structures, institutions, policies, practices, beliefs, values, and economics. The climate crisis impact is layered. It's a complicated mix, and it's pushing us to our limits. It's forcing us to take a closer examination and get some re-education to address humanity and injustice.
So as Ine emphasized, colonization and exploitation of people of color continues to have heartbreaking impacts through systems and structures that maintain and perpetuate inequality. And the climate crisis is making inequality worse. So according to the World Bank, the climate crisis could push 130 million people into poverty in the next 10 years. And there's asymmetry between those who are contributing and those who are being most affected. So as you see here, the richest half of the world is responsible for 86% of greenhouse gas emissions, and the poorest half just 14%. So the richest are responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions, but the climate's response to these emissions is disproportionately hitting communities who contribute the least. So we see these trends both within countries and between countries. So around the globe, low-income urban communities tend to have less tree cover and green space than nearby higher income communities. There tend to be too much asphalt and not enough trees. And some of these low-income urban communities have been measured to be 3 to 10 degrees hotter than neighboring high-income communities. And research has suggested that people in communities without adequate tree cover have a 5% higher chance of dying from heat-related illness. So we also see these disparities between high income and low income countries. For example, children born in high income countries will see twice as many extreme weather events as their parents did, whereas children born in low income countries will see 3 times as many. So we also talk about climate migration, and Megan will talk about this a little bit in the next slide, but this is when people are forced to leave their homes because the climate crisis has made their area uninhabitable. And we see this affecting primarily low-income communities and regions and those who are already marginalized. So I can provide a couple examples that are close to me. During the Camp Fire in Paradise, California, one of my friend's families, his parents, and the entire community was completely destroyed. So his parents lived there because it was affordable, but after the fire, they were among the many people who spent months camping in a Walmart parking lot. So 85 people died in that fire, and my friend's parents and many others were permanently displaced. The second example involves a country that's fairly close to my heart, which is Bangladesh. That's where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer. So it's a very low-lying and densely populated country without adequate infrastructure. It's estimated that a 1 meter rise in sea level could displace 40 million Bangladeshis. So this is an issue of loss of life and irreparable damage.
Inequality is not just an economic issue, it's also about access to opportunities and the capacity to make choices. Take access to education, for example, and the asymmetry experienced by gender. According to UNESCO, 130 million girls, as an estimate, between the ages of 6 to 17 are still denied the right to an education. Discriminatory gender norms and harmful practices deny girls access to school and quality learning. Many families and cultures might favor education for boys, and girls are often prevented from attending school even when they're keen to do so. It's not just about access to education in schools, it's also about feeling safe in classrooms and supported in the subjects and careers they would choose to pursue, including fields in which they are often underrepresented. The climate crisis contributes to education disruption, making this gap worse. The climate crisis is driving forced migrations, or climate refugees, as Adrian referenced, which contributes to war and violence. It also is creating frequent and intense drought and famine, which ties to many family roles and gender norms holding these girls back. Women and children, for example, are responsible for water collection in 71% of sub-Saharan households without drinking water. 25 million women in lower income countries say they want the ability to choose whether and when to become pregnant, which is another thing holding them back from pursuing quality and equal education.
Race is another key piece to the asymmetry we see in education access, achievement, and experience. In the 1960s, researchers developed this term achievement gap while studying disparities in academic performance between groups of students, particularly around race. Shifting from a deficit model, research has also focused now on opportunity gaps in order to better reflect the obstacles and conditions that students are encountering in their educational experiences and how those are tied to inequitable systems that don't really nurture opportunities to succeed and thrive. Studies are also looking at things like outcomes between lower income students, who are often people of color, non-native English speakers, or students in rural communities, for example, and their affluent peers. And more research is also honing in on implicit bias that educators are actually bringing into the classroom and how that bias impacts students' gaps and suspension rates as well. Race is a big topic, and obviously we're not going to be able to touch on every single piece here, but we're hoping that we can tie in how some of it overlaps with climate impacts. So imagine access being an issue already, and then you add climate to the mix. That's definitely going to widen some of the gaps that exist. You have this additional burden of climate impacts exacerbating already existing disparities connected to race, to income, and it can impact the ability to consistently gain access to education. Black, brown, indigenous, and low-income communities are those that suffer the impacts of the climate crisis most immediately and most severely. And missing classes due to climate impacts contributes not only just to the everyday drama of just dealing with things, but also academic deficiencies, and it can simultaneously garner disproportionate distributions of penalties for time away from school. If you remove barriers to access and students then have opportunity with those students with those gaps, then they're very capable of succeeding and finding significance and meaning from their participation in anything from, for example, advanced coursework in K-12 environments or global education experiences in college. When you look at global experiences, Open Doors data is able to tell us a lot about what's going on there. At the top 10 destination lists for Open Doors, some regions of the world are still completely absent, such as Africa and the Middle East. So while we do see that there's improvement for outbound global student, diversity participation by race for US college students, there's still this continued preference for study in certain geographic locations over others. And if you tie that back to thinking about something like colonization and climate impacts, it's impossible for me to really look at a top 10 list now and not wonder, where are these preferences for destination or university partnerships? Where are they stemming from? And how much are they connected potentially to these embedded attitudes and values that we assign to countries and regions of the world through our language, our politics, our history, and our education? I can hear someone's mic is on. I'm just going to let you know. Last year, there was an article called Educating International Students About Race by a woman named Karen Fisher, and she interviewed international students, international educators, and chief diversity officers. I really, really enjoyed that article because a lot of the content I found was relevant not just to international students, but to like campus environments as a whole. So I just wanted to highlight a few things. First of all, she interviewed a graduate student who was from Ecuador. And this student said something that I really liked. She said, I've come to think of learning about being anti-racist the same way I think about learning a language. I'm never going to be perfect at it. I'm going to continue to be corrected, and I'm going to keep trying. Now, what if everyone had that attitude when thinking about race and justice? But you do need a safe space to talk about race often. It can be a stressful experience. It can be embarrassing. It can be challenging. It can be emotional, but it could also be emboldening and a positive experience. But we do need to make sure there's space to have it be part of the conversation and not just in one place, preferably throughout the culture of a campus or an environment. So we also don't want to assume that certain people are the only ones that care about race or that are experiencing anything to do with race. For example, global status does not remove the potential for having a racialized or discriminatory experience, whether that is a person of color that's going to another location, or whether that's an international student, for example, visiting the US. The concepts of race are not always going to present the same way in every location or situation or for every individual. And in Karen Fisher's article, she spoke to Yvonne Garcia, who was a Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusions Officer at the College of Worcester. And she recommended actually for international student discussion on this, finding common ground for international students by drawing conclusions and connections between home countries and the US, for example, maybe talking about colorism or other potential forms of bias in their native cultures. So essentially the key component here is that you have to create spaces, you have to create opportunities to overlap and connect people to one another. You have to extend experiences beyond the campus to within the local community. So it's not just this insular campus experience. And then you have to remember that this is not something that's just a responsibility of the international office or departments or teams. This has to be a team effort, just like when we were dealing with the climate crisis. And the climate crisis is definitely connected back to race and injustice. So all of that has to come together. And faculty and staff representation and voices are very important in this as well, in particular in the classroom. Colleges are starting with academics, so we need to make sure that academics and curriculum reflect and are intentional in bringing these topics to the forefront, but also in connection to things such as hiring who has a voice to teach, who has a voice to share education, and our campus culture as a whole. So I know it's a lot, but how do we begin essentially to better understand the intersections of human experience, especially since these intersectionalities can make particular individuals, groups, communities, or nations more vulnerable to impacts of the climate crisis and injustice?
Thanks, Ine. So as international educators, we're looking for connections across the intersections of climate change, racial and social injustice, and international education, so that we can apply climate action through an international education lens and from a justice-centered perspective. We understand, of course, the impacts of climate change are not being felt equally and need to consider what that means within the context of our field in particular. So first, what is intersectionality? Going back to the start of where we got this term from, intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989 to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. Intersectionality describes the way people from different backgrounds encounter the world, especially across race and gender. Originally used in the context of the court system as a legal term, this has become an important term used to describe how injustices are compounded across a cross-section of intersectional identities. Despite the term's initial obscurity and use primarily in legal spaces, today this is a term widely used and in a sense has gone a bit viral, used around the world to address various human rights. So we want to take this term and let's next apply the concept of intersectionality to climate, racial justice, and international education. Climate change and racial justice are intimately linked crises at the heart of the climate change and environmental justice movement, hence the term climate justice. While this Venn diagram visually highlights these intersections as having an equal overlap, disproportionate impacts of climate change are felt most urgently by low-income, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. It's taken time for many of the large, historic, well-funded nonprofits at the center of climate activism to shift from a climate-first mentality to embrace climate change efforts in a new way. Now, organizations and individuals are beginning to address climate action and solutions in a more just way that centers, includes, and uplifts historically marginalized people and communities. In international education, our efforts to engage in on-site global experiences do contribute to global warming and climate change through the burning of fossil fuels and emission of greenhouse gas by our activities, industries, and travel. It also, though, offers opportunities for transformational experiences. It brings together minds from around the world to create common solutions to global problems. It strengthens partnerships, understanding, and empathy across border and experiences. So keeping that in mind, how do we find a balance in understanding and addressing systemically embedded injustices at local and global levels? See how that's reflected in the disproportionate impacts of climate change, and then take action to be part of the solution as international educators. What would that look like for us? So that's a bit of what we want to talk about, and then take a look at what's next in the coming slides. As we work toward finding climate solutions and taking climate action, we need to consider our past and how it's contributed to barriers and challenges in the present as a field, and work together to connect the dots between climate justice and international education.
So now we're going to take a look at some of the existing issues that occur at the center of that Venn diagram that we just showed. So the hard truth about student mobility is that we still have problems with access. As much as we work to address this issue, international programs remain out of reach for many of our students. So just as we see on the national and global scales, those who contribute most are least affected, and those who contribute least to the climate crisis are precisely those who are impacted first and worst. So if you look at US education abroad as an example, that we're making progress. The most recent data from Open Doors still shows that nearly 70% of US students studying abroad are white, and nearly 70% identify as women. So this is not to say that we want white people or women to stop studying abroad or anybody to stop participating in international programs. This point simply emphasizes that our field reflects a much larger context in which we exist. So for most of us, the demographics of students on our programs don't yet reflect the student populations of our campuses. And for many institutions, our student populations don't reflect our local communities. So the work needs to be done at all levels across all industries. International education is our area of impact. This is where we do the work to address disparities. So Megan will go ahead and talk about program trends.
So on the note of a handprint mentality to assessing and addressing the climate crisis, there's things we can implement into global education programming that allows practitioners and participants in programs to better understand and enact this. One of the ways this is done is through the concept of regenerative programs, which incorporates active regenerative measures as part of the programming. Another way that this is done, and this is something central to all of what the Green Program does on our programs and beyond them, is educating for climate justice with a specific mentality of creating climate activists. This is done by programming which doesn't just educate, but provides inspiration, tools, and long-term connections for students to remain engaged in topics and take what they've learned in the program and bring it back to their campus community, their local community, and their long-term careers.
Thanks. I spent a lot of time as a global education advisor and later as an associate director dealing with risk management. And I would say that while a lot of the things that were happening over the last few years might have been connected back to violence, there were a lot of issues that also were tied to climate, but we weren't necessarily talking about it like that. We weren't talking about it as a climate impact. So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the IPCC report and how it talks about that, we have to take action now, which we all know, but it also talks about we've reached a point in this crisis that even as we're working to mitigate the climate crisis, we're still going to have to expect another 30 years or so at least of extreme climate patterns like the fires and the floods and the drought and the storms that we're experiencing. And a lot of that's going to really start to impact choices and decisions in international education that we make around risk management. I mean, I can imagine a lot of it, but there's a lot of, maybe I can't imagine yet. So let's just start with something. Let's consider health insurance as a key piece. I remember when the pandemic hit and how many people were stressed out in the field because they realized, oh my gosh, there's an exclusion in the insurance and the pandemic is something that's excluded from coverage. So imagine having hundreds or thousands of students abroad and you have to navigate this without potentially the financial support from the insurance provider that's supposed to help in an emergency. That is a very stressful experience. So the climate crisis is impacting global health around the world. How are our students, our staff, our faculty that are disproportionately impacted already treated or supported during a worldwide pandemic? How are they treated or in relation to health matters stemming from environmental exposure in relation to our identities? A lot of this is going to be something that we have to think about both abroad and at home. And health impacts are also connected often to the need to relocate, as are climate impacts. So you might have to consider temporary housing assignments or relocation that might be needed at home or during an on-site global experience. And to give you some examples, Adrienne shared stories with us in the past about trying to navigate a remote search for housing when a group of students on a faculty-led program had a road that was closed, a mudslide that happened during a heavy downpour. So an unexpected change that required someone from back at home to try to help navigate the situation. In my particular case, one of the big ones that was huge for me was dealing with the earthquakes in Mexico. The entire partner campus was damaged. We could no longer have students continue to have their classes on site. Their housing, which was off campus in this case, was also damaged, and we had to get them immediately into temporary housing, and it was at night. And so you then imagine having to deal with not only relocation for just immediate cases, but then also their studies were being disrupted. How are we going to find a new place for them to continue? Do they have to come home and then they have nothing to do at home, or is there a way for us to help them continue? So luckily we were able to work with our partners, the insurance provider, and the students themselves and their families to find some solutions. And then just lastly, I think back to my own time as a graduate student at San Jose State University. And I lived with a group of international students, also grad students, and they were all studying their full degree in the US. And our apartment, the roof leaked severely after some big storms that weren't really expected. And it wasn't immediately fixed by our landlords. So the conditions of the apartment became very unhealthy for us. And my roommates were really scared to challenge the situation. I remember talking to them about us having rights and that we needed to stay united in our effort to get fair treatment. In the end, it worked out for us, but it was stressful and it needed us, we had to navigate local laws, health support, and financial stress in the middle of our graduate studies and in a city that wasn't our home. None of us was from San Jose. So essentially what I'm saying is there's going to be a need to adapt to both the expected and the unexpected changes and situations that come about from climate change and also how that disproportionately impacts different groups of people. The climate crisis is shifting. We're seeing higher frequencies and emergency climate disasters. Transportation is also going to be something that's a big part of risk management conversations, especially since climate impacts to transit can restrict or reduce access, impact mobility in general, and then also lead to last minute changes in mobilization actions and efforts during emergency. So just a lot to navigate and think about when we're dealing with all these things.
Thanks, Ine. And a final few things to keep in mind when it comes to existing issues in the field would be, first of all, keeping an eye on overall program trends. Open Doors data shows a dramatic increase in short-term programs in recent years. Keeping in mind that regardless of duration, travel has been a required component of participation. And whether a student pursues their entire degree abroad or does a 2-week-long program, theoretically, they could do so with one round-trip ticket. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And another thing to keep in mind is a concept that we refer to as greenwashing. So greenwashing is the process of conveying a false impression or providing intentionally misleading information about how a company's products might be more environmentally sound. It's considered to be an unsubstantiated claim intended to deceive consumers into believing a company's products are environmentally friendly. It's a marketing ploy that businesses do to enact to attract consumers that want to be environmentally responsible without doing the work of actually being a environmentally responsible organization. In recent years, we've seen a lot of exciting progress in the field and in our community pertaining to sustainability. It's been positive, of course, to see conferences and communities like the Forum center this in conversations, launch community guidelines, integrate the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals into operations. But as we see more and more organizations, programs, and offices seek more sustainable practices, it's important for us as responsible educators to ensure we're on the lookout for any greenwashing which might happen in our field. Vetting the systems behind the slogans, asking tough questions, understanding the myriad practices and challenges that go along with working towards genuine sustainability can all help us in this endeavor. Understanding it takes much more than just offsetting flights to be a sustainable traveler, thinking about the carbon handprint or the positive environmental impact mentioned earlier, as opposed to just a carbon footprint. The negative carbon impact are just some of the ways that we can approach this. So on the note of that handprint and that footprint and looking positively forward, I'll hand it back to Adrienne.
Thank you. So yeah, now that we've explored some of the existing issues at the intersection of climate justice and international education, let's take a moment to talk about some of the positive actions we can take moving forward. So as Pitulia mentioned in the welcome video and Megan mentioned in the last slide, in addition to the concept of the carbon footprint, there's an emerging concept of the carbon or ecological handprint. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit more, but first a couple of points about the footprint. And I think Ine just shared in the chat an article to support this. So the carbon footprint is a measure of the impact your activities have on the amount of greenhouse gases produced through the burning of fossil fuels, and is expressed as a weight of CO2 measured in tons. So the article that Ine shared, as well as several others, have linked the popularization of the term carbon footprint to British Petroleum in a marketing effort to shift blame from the fossil fuel industry to the individual consumer. So the fact that this term has become so commonly used shows the wide-reaching influence of the fossil fuel industry. I mean, they're in our heads. And of course, our individual behaviors and spending habits do add up, and collectively they can drive change, positive or negative. So where the footprint is a measure of your negative impact, the handprint is a measure of positive impact. So the idea is to shift focus from the doom and gloom into action and positive change. Rather than terrifying people about their individual or collective carbon footprint, the handprint concept encourages action toward positive environmental impact. So the goal here is to have a handprint that's larger than your footprint. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Ine to talk about program locations.
Okay, thank you. You caught me off guard there for a minute. I thought Megan was going first. No problem. I'll go ahead first.
We skipped around a little bit.
No worries. Okay. So, you know, I talked a little bit about earlier the fact that you have different languages that you kind of think about when you think of connected to colonization or history. But you see a lot of this also, well, okay, let me just go back for a second. The open doors, they summarize every year kind of a summary of who's going, where they're going, all this kind of fun stuff. And what I think is really interesting is that there hasn't been a lot of change in kind of the top areas. Right now, the data from Open Doors shows that about over 55% or so of US college students are choosing to study abroad in Europe. And in the 2018-2019 data, they highlighted that about 40% of US students are studying in just five countries: the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany. And what's so funny to me is that if you ask any international educator to guess which 5, they'll probably get it right. You know, it's just, it's such a thing. The report also highlighted, though, you know, there are efforts to support policies to support diversity and participation by underrepresented students groups and by location during global experiences as ways to prepare for college success and collectively to strengthen our economy, diplomacy, and national security. And this also helps strengthen ability to work in other countries. But we also need to consider how diversity can shift values and beliefs as part of these experiences. I do want to point out that, you know, regardless of the final destination where students are going, the global emissions from travel is going to continue to carry an unequal global burden for less wealthy nations, especially in the local and rural populations. And I did share a link to some of this data earlier, but I'll make sure to share it again. And then just in terms of connected to flying, you know, because you have to get to the location. One thing I would say is, as staff and faculty that are supporting students, maybe we could start by looking at when do we actually need to travel or not. If there's travel that's needed, maybe we can leave that to the students to get to that point and give them a chance to have that and figure out ways for us to connect them to opportunities to be thoughtful about their choices. We know the field of international education depends on travel, mostly by air. So not only students fly to their destinations, but a lot of our staff and faculty do professional development, they visit partners, they recruit students, they attend conferences, and so much more. So some more thoughtful thinking about when that's actually necessary is going to be an important piece of this. And air travel does account for about 2.5% of global carbon dioxide emissions, which maybe doesn't seem like a lot at the moment, but emissions are growing rapidly with the expansion of low-cost airlines and a booming tourism industry. Even if the aviation industry, you know, if it meets all of its emission targets, it's still going to have consumed about 12% of the global carbon budget, or 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. If it fails to reach its targets, aviation's share of the budget could rise as much as 27%. And in our field, the trend has been moving towards, as was mentioned earlier, short-term programs. So the challenge is that short-term programs, which equal more flights, they can improve accessibility to transformative international experiences. So we have to get creative and find ways to continue to improve access while reducing our negative impact. And I would say part of that also is going to include thinking about how we advise students and the language we use, because that can influence students' decisions to pursue a particular program type or destination, or have a certain value or belief around a particular region. And I have endless stories of students sharing comments from friends, family, faculty, staff that drive their decisions to pursue a particular experience before they even know what opportunities exist. So it's really important that students understand what's at their table and how to access and understand their available options to make informed decisions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Ine. So since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen a boom in virtual education, so virtual global programming. And I'm among those who champion COIL at my institution. I fully believe that these and other virtual programs can be incredibly valuable learning experiences. They can be a wonderful way to improve access to global learning for those who are unable to travel. However, virtual programming should be a part of a diverse portfolio of programs and should not be viewed as a substitute for immersive international experiences. So we invited Andrew Gordon of Diversity Abroad to speak at our CANIE Live 2-part series back in February. And in it, he brought up a word of caution about using virtual programs to expand access to underserved students. So we really need to be cognizant to avoid creating 2 separate streams of global education opportunities. So one for students who have the resources to travel abroad and one for those who do not. So as we move forward with incorporating global learning into curricula by virtually connecting students around the globe, this is a reminder to continue working to increase access to all global learning opportunities.
Great. So whether this is something you're already working hard on at your organization or at your institution, or if this is something entirely new to you or new to your role, let's talk about finding a starting point or potentially a new starting point moving forward from today. So on this slide, I would just want to take a look at some of the things that are already happening, and then we can take a look at potentially what should happen next. The field of international education has started to bring conversations about climate change and sustainability into the fold, amplifying these topics, addressing them in industry standards, best practices, partnerships, portfolios, and more. So we want to highlight some of those actions taking place already to help international educators begin or continue to unite and take bold action together. To note, though, this slide provides a small sample of what is being done and is limited to a few key regions. As we move into the discussion and networking portion of today's session, coming in just about 10 minutes, we'd love to hear from anyone today who's attending, other things they're aware of, other initiatives at your campus, at your organization, or in the field that we can all learn from, and begin to discuss next steps for how we can move those initiatives forward together. In the meantime, though, so some of the things of note would be NAFSA, which has been doing work to bring these conversations into their folds. They've been a longstanding global organization involving all areas and players across a number of different regions, and it's been exciting to see them form a sustainability special interest group created to help colleagues connect and discuss and act to create more sustainable practices. They've invited CANIE board members to be a part of assessing where they are and where we are as a field in terms of sustainability. They've been bringing topics into the fold at the annual conference and are going to continue that trend year on year, which is exciting to see. And they've also been highlighting justice in particular within the fold of sustainability into events and workshops throughout the year. Similarly, the Forum on Education Abroad, as the standards development organization for the field, recently created a guide to advancing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals through education abroad. Our colleague presenting here today, Adrienne, could speak to anybody curious more about that. She played a pivotal role in launching and implementing those guidelines. And Forum has also, similar to NAFSA, integrated sustainability topics into events, workshops, and their annual conference. It was their main topic for their past annual conference and will feature in future conferences coming up this year. Other organizations to keep an eye on, including listed at the bottom of this list, a US-based organization, which has global ties and a really exciting and interesting global conference. If you haven't attended, I definitely recommend checking it out. That's the ASHE organization. This one is not focused on international education specifically, but rather brings together sustainability-minded professionals and staff members and faculty from across higher education as a whole to engage with one another about how we can create a more sustainable campus and future for the students that we're educating there. So it's not limited to international educators, but it does include them. And increasingly, it's been encouraging to see people in sustainability offices or faculty members involved in ASHE reaching out to international education professionals and bringing those conversations together for broader collaboration. And then in other regions, of course, AIEC, which is the Australian International Education Conference, has featured a lot of topics related to sustainability, and EAIE, the European Association for International Educators, has been doing a lot to bring these conversations to the forefront of their region as well. And again, of course, this is a small sample of what's happening around the world. We just wanted to bring to the forefront topics and conversations that we're aware of already happening. And again, if there's anything you're aware of, you can drop it into the chat, but also stick around for our networking happening soon, and we'd love to hear more about that.
So as you move through the rest of the week here, I hope you'll be joining us for some of the other events. CANIE's COP26 Climate Action Week, we're going to encourage you to keep climate justice anchored in your thoughts and your plans. And we want to remind you that there are already ways to get involved with ongoing efforts through some of the organizations that Megan mentioned, through some of the organizations that we hope that you're going to share with us. And I encourage you to consider, what are you going to be a part of? Well, with CANIE, there's some ways for you to get involved straight away. We have 3 chapters that we have now that are going to be hosting regional meetings this week. One of them is the New Americas chapter, which ended up being a combination of Canada and the USA coming together to make Americas. And we want to expand that to express all the Americas until we have more representation throughout. And they're going to have an information session actually on Wednesday, November 10th at 12 noon Pacific time. So if that's your region, please feel free to join them. And we'll also make sure to have a global region meeting that's going to be available because we do not have representation yet for all of our chapters. So we want to make sure there's a space for everyone to come together. CANIE also has ways to connect. We have a website which allows you to go there and sign up to be part of the newsletter receipt. We also are active on social media where you can connect to, and or if you have skills in using social media, you want to be involved with CANIE in that way and helping communicate messages out. LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, even Facebook still. And then our podcast, which I love, and the wonderful CJ Tremblay. She is situated in Vancouver, Canada, and she's just been amazing at bringing the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast to life. You've got to check out the last one on regenerativity. Man, I have a hard time saying that word, but that is so good. And then if you are feeling it when it comes to climate justice, like Megan and Adrian and I apparently did, which is why I've been talking about this so much, we have a Slack group. We have a working group. If you want to get involved and just get started, if you want to bring some conversations like this to your space, join us. Let's get you on Slack and get that going.
Thank you so much, Ine. Yeah, I'm super excited about this. But now that you've seen ways that you can get involved in this movement, we want to encourage you to take some very simple actions immediately. So first, we invite you to think differently. So please fight the desire to return to what we knew as normal before the pandemic. Trust us, we know that flying around the globe might be part of your identity as an international educator, but this moment really demands a culture shift. To Ine's earlier point, please rethink if travel is absolutely necessary for meeting colleagues, attending conferences, and doing the work of international education. When you do fly, really make it worth it. Maybe combine, like Ine said before, all of those pointers for really getting the most out of the travel that you do take. So until we have clean jet fuel, which is one of my hopes and dreams, please save the flights for the students and make sure their experiences help them to improve our collective situation. Amplify the message across your networks. Talk about climate justice. Use your influence to inspire others to want to do more and to take action. So we have a challenge, should you choose to accept it. So next week coming up is International Education Week, and there will be lots of programming about the benefits of international education. So our challenge to you is to think about climate justice during the events you attend during IEW and make a comment or ask a question about the climate and social justice impacts on the topic. And let us know how it goes. So we encourage you to start conversations, even if you might not feel prepared to do so. So that brings me to the next point. So we hear a lot from people providing feedback to CANIE that they don't really feel knowledgeable enough to move climate justice forward, or maybe they feel like they don't have the right background or have the right lived experience to speak about climate justice. This is our collective problem, and it requires our collective action to address it. So if you're feeling a little unprepared in terms of the science or anything behind the climate crisis, we're dropping a couple links in the chat for you. So the first one is the Climate Reality Project. It's Al Gore's organization that trains climate reality leaders to speak about the climate crisis. So both CANIE's co-founders, Elsa Lamont and Pitulia Nicola, and all three of the panelists here, or the presenters here today, are trained climate reality leaders. The next one is Project Drawdown. So you saw one of their images that Ine shared earlier, but they're a great online training program, and they're really focused on solutions. So if you're looking for solutions in any particular area, they have a great database of solutions. So you can do these trainings on your own, or actually invite them into your classroom if you're teaching. So we really want you to check both of those out. So climate justice will look different around the world. So obviously this session reflects the speakers' perspectives as US Americans, and we like to incorporate other perspectives, other global perspectives. And as a global organization, CANIE is in a unique position to speak to this issue on a global level and inform a variety of perspectives and experiences. We have the ability to create space for voices that are not currently and historically marginalized. So our industry is really poised to combine our efforts to address integrated solutions. We may not have all of the solutions now, but we hope that this session has sparked a fire and a call to action for you. As Naomi Klein in her book On Fire, The Case for the Green New Deal said, we face so many overlapping and intersecting crises that we cannot afford to fix them one at a time. We need integrated solutions that radically bring down emissions while creating huge numbers of good unionized jobs and delivering meaningful justice to those who have been most abused and excluded under the current extractive economy. So reflecting on these topics, finding allies and opening dialogue are just some of the first steps. While we may not always feel that we have the knowledge and skill set to address these complex issues on our own, we are united, we're here for you, and we can make a difference together. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to follow up in regard to anything we've discussed today or to connect in relationship to our organizations, we invite you to take note of our contact details on this slide. We also encourage you to be in touch with us and join the international education community effort to advance climate justice. We'll be dropping a link to the session evaluation in the chat. So we pay very close attention to your feedback, and we really would invite you to take a moment to complete that evaluation for us. We are interested in your thoughts. And now we'll go ahead and move into the Q&A. And then following the Q&A, we'll move into the networking session. And we really hope you'll stick around and join us for that.
Thanks. I just wanted to remind everyone too that if some people were asking about the links in the chat, you can save the chat. There's a little 3 dots down at the bottom that allows you to save the chat. So you're welcome to do that anytime, but we will go ahead and make sure that we share those with you since there's been questions about it. And align it to what we were speaking about. So if there's any questions, you're welcome to either add them to the chat or to raise your hand, and we'll change the view right now to allow us to kind of connect with anyone's here. But we also can just break up into spaces and have you have smaller conversations with one another if there's not a lot of questions. So we really do appreciate you being here. And I know it's a lot to digest. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get to the point where you're able to put all those questions together. So I'm going to take a moment and see if there's any questions here in the chat. And if so, we'll address some of those. And Megan and Adrian, if you wouldn't mind seeing if there's anyone raising their hand for me while I'm doing that. And then in a couple of minutes, if there's not a lot of questions, we'll just go straight into the breakout spaces so that you all can talk to one another. Let's see. Thanks for the wonderful comments. Really appreciate it. We're trying hard to keep this conversation going in our field and evolving what we say every time. But, you know, we really appreciate being here. All right.
So I guess just to kind of spark dialogue. Oh, good, a hand.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Elise, how do you say your name?
Hello. Yes, Elise, that's perfect. Thank you so much. It was a really interesting conversation. I guess I had a question which maybe sounds really fairly pessimistic and do not reflect my students or what I think of them, but I'm trying to figure out how to work with them in all of these different topics while at the same time thinking about social justice and kind of take away what used to be a few years ago, the white savior going to Africa to build schools and, all of these things that they could do because they were coming from, and kind of also opening the eyes of the students towards the same but with climate action. So they remove themselves from, oh my God, they use plastic bags in this country, and without kind of understanding the wider topic. So it's kind of, how do we add that extra layer in how we talk to potentially students in their own, and educated them and us and everyone in the process.
Well, there's a lot to unpack with that question. So let me just tell you one thing that I started to do when I got involved with CANIE, because sometimes it does feel like a little bit overwhelming. You're like, wait, how do I address this? How do I bring this to the table? What if I'm the only one talking about it? So one of the first things that I started to do in my reflection on this was look at what we're already doing, let's say in particular with students. I was working with international students and study abroad students, for example. What types of activities are we doing with students, and how can I look at the outline of what we're presenting or what opportunities we're providing for them to connect and think about that in a much broader context? So for example, this is just, I prefer to start with what I'm passionate about. So I am passionate about alternative transportation and transit equity. I think everyone should have ability to get around and not depend on a car. That's just my thing because I've never owned a car and I get around on my bicycle. So for me, I'm passionate about that. And also nobody else in my job rode a bike or took a bus. I was the only one. So I really felt isolated in that experience. So I said, how can I encourage my colleagues and encourage the students that I serve who often are driving and the international students who are visiting to come together and feel united in this one experience, and to talk about that in our engagement and our activities, like literally use that as a way to say, you don't have to have a car to do things. And essentially the catalyst for all that came because I kept hearing people say, I can't do anything here, I don't have a car. And I was doing all these things and I wanted to find ways to connect that. So when I did that, I started to find out more about what was happening in the community also. So, oh, hey, look, they're doing an event that's helping us connect to what's happening in the community and how it's impacting our environment. And even though it wasn't necessarily, I wouldn't say we're doing this for the environment, I was just bringing them to a community space and giving them a way to get engaged with different people than the campus, and talking about the people that were running the event would talk about why it was important or how it connected to our community. So I don't always have to be the one creating the discussion, but I do need to connect the links. So it is a little bit, you got to kind of step back because it's not just our office in our roles. We have to also consider the conversation has to be happening in the classroom too. We have to have it embedded in some of the things that are being taught. I don't know, like you just said something about plastic bags, right? And what if someone said, oh, why are they using plastic bags? Well, maybe in some countries, that's the only thing they can afford to use. To, like, when I lived in Mexico, everybody would take the bottle, pour the soda into the plastic bag so that you didn't have to take the bottle because the bottle's worth money. And so they would, but so it's small steps, but the biggest piece is that there's a whole entire network of people that are already doing things. So what I really recommend is start to reflect on what you are doing already and think about, what if I was adding a layer of climate and justice to this? What could that look like? And then start to reach out to the network to say, this is what I'm doing. Is anyone else, are there spaces to consider how we can reflect on this? And it can't be a one-time thing either. That's the other issue. How do we infuse it across the entire experience? So I'm not answering like, here's exactly a definitive answer, but that's a starting point. But maybe Adrienne or Megan have some other, because they do different things, and you got to be intentional about all this.
Yeah, and I really appreciate this question, and I relate a lot to it. It's like, this is a lot, it's like, how do you, with all of these complexities, how do you really not feel overwhelmed and overloaded and just have that just retreat effect, right? So I would encourage you with your students to really hone in on one topic, one area that is really close to their heart, that they really identify with. For example, it could be connected to their identity. Maybe they're really interested in LGBT issues around the globe. To really focus on that and have one real focus area, and then be aware of all of these other issues, the extreme weather events and everything else. It's hard to avoid, but all of that in relation to that one topic. It might help to kind of keep things a little bit compartmentalized and easier to digest. And also, I would really emphasize taking care of yourself, because we cannot do this work if we're too overwhelmed and overloaded and just kind of in that retreat mindset. So self-care, we need to take care of ourselves in order to be able to do this work. And our students know that very well. they're leading these movements. The young people are out there in the streets actually demanding action. So yeah, that would be my my advice there.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that, Ina and Adrienne both gave good insight there. would be from the Green Program perspective, just really prioritizing having those conversations openly with students, getting their input and their perspective. You know, they might bring things to the conversation that benefits other people, especially if it's a diverse group of participants in your classroom or program. And then also prioritizing hearing from people around the world. Through our programming, we talk about these topics, we bring them either in person or virtually to meet with community leaders or industry innovators and hearing from them from their perspective, how to address these topics. For example, we have a virtual program that's entitled and all about the ethics of sustainable development. And that's what I thought of when you mentioned the plastic bag example, because they talk about things like poverty or things you might not always consider when it comes to sustainable development, and what considerations you do have to think about that impact people in specific communities, but around the world.
Yeah, and I think that Adrian and Megan's comment about bringing the students' voices in, that's always what I did, even though it was my idea, like the transit, that was just what I was passionate about. I can't move forward unless I get input from other people. So I just brought together a group of international and study abroad alum and said, you know, let me learn a little bit more about how you get around and get their input, and then suggest some things and get their ideas. And we came up with an idea together. So, but you know, it's a really, I don't see other hands up right now. So I know, and there's about there's just a small group here, but if anyone who would like to hang around for a little bit longer, we can go ahead and break out into breakout rooms for just a bit, maybe around 15 minutes. So I'm gonna go ahead and just initiate some breakout rooms so that people can connect to one another. And what I would say for that is maybe to consider, you know, what's one action you could take when we're thinking about going together. What's one action that you can take to advance climate justice in your work? So since we're talking about narrowing it down to one, when we break out, let's see if that you maybe can help one another with that. And if you have to leave, no problem, but it was great to have you here. Hopeful for anyone who's still here, we'll hope you can stick around for a little bit.